or when you first become interested in ceramics, however that happens, there are so many different options that you can, so many different paths. And you're going down a main road and there's all these turnings, you know, there's raku and there's stoneware and there's earthenware, there's slipware, there's all sorts of things. And it's very difficult to begin with. You go down every side turning and it's very exciting. But eventually you find a road that looks really more interesting than the rest. And that depends on your personality. I have always tried to be very honest about the reasons why I do things. I love painting, I love the countryside, I love the landscape, I love this landscape, the sort of English landscape, and particularly the Devon landscape with this wonderful coastline. And I want to make work which reflects that, and earthenware somehow for me seems quintessentially English, and I'm not really interested in aesthetics that come from different cultures. I'm interested in looking at the landscape around me and making things which condense and express the joy that I get from that landscape. So for me, brightly coloured earthenware seems to do that. When I first started making earthenware, I made slipware, and I was very interested in that English aesthetic. I saw some beautiful toff dishes in a museum in York, and I was totally blown away by the vibrance of the colour and the glaze. And so I spent my last year at college exploring earthenware glazes, trying to recreate that wonderful sort of juicy brightness, that depth, because for me that encapsulated the sort of feelings that I had about making things out of clay. And then I went to work with John Pollock's, and that was great fun, and together we explored some ideas in terms of glaze, both trying to get the same thing really, this juicy, rich, bright earthenware glaze. And we had a happy accident one day and found a way of making the glaze even brighter. But then sooner or later you become bored with the results that you can achieve, and you want to expand your colour palette. And when I was at college, in my last year, I spent a lot of time doing glaze chemistry and exploring the possibilities of making bright colours, not just those lovely rich iron colours, but other colours too. And so eventually I came back to that and worked with one colour at a time, trying to produce brighter and brighter versions of that colour. Because it was a way of expressing those feelings I had about the landscape. I spent 2 years in Gibraltar as a teenager, and those Mediterranean colours have a huge impact on you, and I just couldn't ignore that. But to begin with, I fell in love with the whole process of throwing on the wheel. It's a very magical thing. That's what made me want to be a potter in the first place, was that I had to go on the wheel and thought, wow, this is fantastic, you know, what a nice way to earn a living. You know, it was the late 60s and things were changing and people were looking at different ways of earning a living, you know, more exciting and interesting ways rather than just a job in an office somewhere. And the idea of being a potter really appealed to me. And so I fell in love with that process. And it was only really when I went to college that I discovered hand building, and again I found that the different ways of expressing yourself through hand building, coiling and slabbing, gave rise to a totally different type of form. But it was only really when I started making pots for a living that I went back to slab building, because I found that I was limited in my use of form by forms which were thrown on the wheel. So I wanted to make things which were not round, things which were constructed. And so I started experimenting with different methods of slab building. And because I wanted to make functional pieces, I was also limited by the weight of the piece, because when you pick a piece up, it has to feel right in your hand. It's important when you throw to throw the right thickness. It mustn't be too heavy, but it also mustn't be too light. And the same is true when you hand build. You have to make a piece which identifies with the idea that your brain has about how much it's going to weigh. So I started constructing with very thin slabs, 4 to 5 millimeters. And just through a process of failure, I discovered a way of making things which I managed to keep in one piece, but which were totally different to anything that anybody else was making. When I say they're derived from the countryside, they're derived mostly from details of the countryside. And it's only really when you live in the countryside 24/7 that you see it in its true light. When I walk to work or ride to work, or when I go and walk on the cliffs or beachcomb, I find all sorts of things that are very brightly coloured. You know, it might be a leaf, it might be a flower, a butterfly wing, you know, a shell, bits of flotsam and jetsam on the beach. I draw a lot, and then very often I take little details from the drawings and I might turn them through 90 degrees and redraw them, or just take a little piece and redraw it without regard to its origin. So eventually I come up with ideas which are landscape based, but which don't have a direct relationship with that landscape, if that makes sense. And because of my need to find colour, I find it in unusual things, but it's there. There's a huge amount of colour even in the winter. I went for a walk yesterday, it's February, there's gorse out on the cliffs. The yellow is absolutely stunning, and when you take one flower and look at it up close, that's extraordinary. But when you look at things on that level, when you look at them really intently, when you get down on your hands and your knees and you look in a way that a child looks, you see in a totally different way. I love that. I do that a lot. I spend so much of my time on my own. I often walk out to the cliffs because it's 2 minutes walk, and I'm just blown away by it. I'm blown away by the light and shade, by the forms. I love the forms of the landscape, the curves and the lines. I like the little straight line intrusions that man's introduced, things like fence posts and gates and telegraph poles. But I also like all the rubbish that I find on the beach. Some of the things, you know, old plastic bottles and tin cans and bits of wood, such interesting shapes. I've got a huge collection of bits and pieces that I've brought back from the high tide line. And, you know, if I need inspiration, I just grab a few pieces and start drawing. And usually something comes out of that. It's a development process. So it's not a direct response. It's a way of... The way I like to sum it up is that I can walk across the beach, a beach of millions and millions of pebbles, and I'll pick one up. So the secret is, can you go back to the studio and stare at that pebble and work out why you picked up that one? And if I can do that, if I can isolate what it was that touched my button, you know, I can use that to touch someone else's button. And it might be something very simple, and often is. There's a particular image that I use that I'm very fond of, and it finds its way onto lots of my pots, and it's this image here. And basically it's 2 hillsides and 3 telegraph poles. And because I've isolated it and used it as a graphic image for so long, it's become its own little image. But it still has that origin for me, and so for me it speaks of the countryside. Similarly, things like this originally came from a black and white feather that I found, and I was intrigued by the way it contrasted with the bright colours on my pots. And I realised that if I put black and white on the colour, it intensified the value of the colour. If I cover that up, you can see the colour is not as intense as it is when the black and white is there. So then I started looking for other bits of black and white. And again, it might be a moth wing or a line of trees silhouetted against the sky. All sorts of things like that, which allow me to play games with the imagery and the colour. You see, for me, these are, although they're highly decorative, they are essentially functional pieces because they're based on the idea of function. So a teapot, a mug, a plate, they're vessel based. And then I was sat on the cliffs one day and I thought, you know, it'd be really nice just to make some things which were a more direct response to the landscape. So then I started making things like this. And I was looking for a way of making objects which still involved colour, but in a more subtle way, and colour which was matte instead of shiny. So more like the colours that I see in the landscape. So these glazes are a new range of glazes that I've developed using basic minerals that occur in this landscape. So things like tin and copper and iron, lead. This particular glaze has got chromium in it as well. So that helps to generate this orange colour. But the interesting thing about these glazes is that they have a colour response which is emphasised by the thickness of the glaze. So this colour here, this sort of sage green, it's exactly the same glaze as this and this and this. They're just different thicknesses, and so the colour response is different. But also it allowed me to make use of these landscape forms here. This particular line here I like a lot because when I stand on the cliffs and look west or east, these are the lines that I see. These little hard rock promontories here, and the hillside gets eroded away from these little points, and that's interesting. At the same time as I was exploring these glazes, I was also exploring the idea of a different sort of surface. This is terra sigillata, it's polished clay. We're very blessed in this part of the country that we have wonderful ball clay deposits, and this terra sigillata is made from a ball clay that comes from Newton Abbot. So there's a nice sort of unity about the piece because it's landscape based, but it also uses minerals from this landscape to create its surfaces and its ideas. This section in the top here comes from a little gully just down below my studio in the cliffs, where the pebbles seem to organise themselves vertically in the grooves in the rocks. And I was fascinated by that, so I tried playing this game with pebbles in the top of this bowl. The thing about these, although they're sort of vessel based, they have no openings, so they're sculptural vessels, if you like. But they're just objects rather than pieces which are defined by their function.